on a very exciting topic that many of us have been waiting for, which is the creation of the Smithsonian Museum and the work of the National Women's History Museum as well. I would like to take 1 minute of your time to remember somebody that we lost in the last 2 weeks, and that is my friend Linda Maloney. Linda was, let me see if I can get share screen. Yeah. Linda, can you guys all see that now? Oh, I hope not. I don't know. Sherry, do you see it?
No.
No, okay, I didn't hit share yet. Wait a minute. I gotta hit share. Share. And hit share. Okay, come on. Oh, share in the box, right. Linda Mahoney was a dear friend of many of us. She was a very dedicated feminist. I've known her for years through the National Organization for Women and other things. She was a women's rights activist par excellence. She fought like heck for pay equity, equal rights, and human rights. She was trained as a lawyer, actually, and so knew a bit about it. She was president in Ramita of Maryland State now, and she was the chair of the Harriet Tubman Statue Commission, which actually, about 4 days after her death, they introduced another measure to get the statue of Tubman done. Not that it's gone anywhere yet, but it hasn't. But most importantly, she was a very devoted spouse of the late Edith Miller. And the one redeeming factor of all this, she died of a heart attack. She called the paramedics, but they didn't get there in time. Is that now Edith and she are together again, which is really a wonderful thing. So if we could have a moment of silence, that would be great. Okay. All right, Sue, I am now going to turn this over to you and stop sharing. And there we are. And it's all yours, and I'm going on mute.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the meeting. As Connie just said, we're delighted to celebrate Women's History Month with a very informative and exciting discussion of the new Smithsonian American Women's History Museum and all of the related work that has gone into its creation to date. We have a wonderful set of panelists who are very informed on this topic to join us, and we're going to be starting with Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who many of us add extra thanks to the wonderful Oversight Committee hearing that she had yesterday on DC's statehood. Carolyn, thank you so much for the wonderful job on that. Many of us are DC residents and looking forward to having statehood and our 2 senators, as well as our wonderful Congresswoman Eleanor Norton. We'd like to invite you to start the presentation. We understand you have to leave early to go to another hearing, and we very much appreciate you showing up for this one.
Well, thank you so much, Sue and Connie Cordovilla, for putting this together. I'm delighted and thrilled to be here. I do want to share, I have another hearing tomorrow, and it starts at what, 10 o'clock? I think it's 10 o'clock, but it's on the national, it's the pay gap. It's National Pay Gap Day. And so we're looking not only at the pay stub problem for the pay gap, but what does it mean over a lifetime? And paying people less means they're the largest section of poverty and a largest area of wealth gap between men and women. And it's going to be another very important hearing. And I want Christina Parisi, who's on my staff, to get the coordination and how to reach you. I'll send a notice to everybody on the forum about the hearing tomorrow, and then we'll be able to update you as we move forward with the first and only American Museum of National History in the Smithsonian, the best area I tell you, it's a project that I started working on in 1998. I thought this is going to be easy. It's non-controversial. It's a museum. And when we started out, we weren't even asking for any money. Just let us build our own museum on the mall. And I can't tell you that it turned out to be such an effort. It took me 23 years working with a whole slew of wonderful women, many of whom are joining us today and are on this call, that were part of moving us to this moment. The most shocking thing I learned in the 23 years was how hard it is to get anything done, to empower and honor and applaud the efforts of the wonderful women who have brought us to where we are and are working now to go further. So I want to thank CWI for this kind invitation. I also want to very much underscore the feminist majority and my good friend Ellie Smeal. She has consistently supported this effort and every effort to advance women and to advance women's rights that I know of. She is one of the strongest links that connects us together as we work together to help other women. I am thrilled to be able to share with you the legislation to establish the Smithsonian Women's History Museum was signed into law this September. And it was a pleasure to participate in this discussion during Women's History Month, along with other women who've been so instrumental in passing this legislation and are leading us forward. It certainly takes a village to get anything done, and it took a village to get this Women's Museum done. I'm pleased that Julissa Marenco from the Smithsonian is joining us to give more details of the success of the Women's History Initiative and the steps being taken to start creating what will be an extraordinary museum. And I was working, the way it started, and this is a true story, 23 years ago, on a beautiful day like today, I was walking around the mall, the mall of the Capitol, and thinking about how I could build support for the Equal Rights Amendment, which we are hoping to ratify in the Constitution very soon. And I was having a hard time getting Republican support. So I was trying to think of a project we could work together on that would be confidence building, that would not be controversial, and that would be easy to pass. And I was walking around the mall and you couldn't help but notice museums on textiles, space, law and order, postal. All of these museums are in and around the mall, but there wasn't anything. And I started asking probably my most famous quote. Gloria Steinem even put it in her play. Where are the women? I started looking, where are the women? They're half the population. They've got to be on the mall. They've got to be here somewhere. I kept looking and I looked everywhere. There was no women on the mall. So I thought this is an oversight. We'll put women on the mall, but there's got to be women's museums across the country that project and help women. Well, I guess found out that there is not one women's museum in the United States dedicated to advancing, protecting, supporting the contributions of women to our great country. We have what I call sliver museums, very skinny museums dedicated to one thing. In my great state of New York, we have Seneca Falls for the first women's rights movement. We have in Ohio a museum for the first ladies of the country. We have in Oklahoma, Annie Oakley. Out in LA, we have a museum for the women of the West, but nothing that looks at our scientists, our teachers, our warriors, all of the women that have contributed to this country. So I said, wow, that's going to be easy. Everybody will love this idea. Well, I put the bill in 23 years ago, and it has been a battle the whole way. First, in the meetings that I had, they told us there was no way women could be on the mall. Why not? Everything else is on the mall. I said, you probably want to put a man there and say that he's more important than all the women in America. Well, we finally found out that the way to get on the mall is you have to create a commission and fund it and have a report, a bipartisan report, whether they look at whether or not women are important enough to be on the mall. So we created this commission. It was so hard to pass. And during that time, I did a study with our interns that in our capital, only 13 of the 200 plus statues in the US Capitol depict women. Only 5% of the approximately 2,400 national monuments that are in our country honor the work of women. And a study of 18 history textbooks showed that just 10% of the material documented the contributions of women. I can remember as a young student in grade school, going to the library and to try to find a book on women, and I couldn't find anything. I finally found a series about first ladies, little blue slim books, and they were sad stories usually. And my daughters, when I would read stories, they would say, "Mother, why can't you read me a story about women? All the stories are about Johnny and the snow and Johnny and the bat, and very few of anything was depicting our stories." And it took 16 years. I partnered with Marsha Blackburn. She was from Tennessee, and Tennessee played a huge role. That was the last state to ratify, to vote for us to have the 19th Amendment to have the vote. And one of the first actions for the vote were in New York. So we had the first and the ending and everything in between, and working very, very hard for years. We created this commission. It took 16 years to pass it. And Wendy Pangburn was the executive director, and I believe she's on it with us. It was bipartisan. It was a congressional commission that spent 18 months studying it. All of the congressional leaders had appointments, and Jane Abraham chaired it. She was a Republican. She did an absolutely excellent job. And it then said, yes, of course, women should be on the mall. Women should have a national history, and it should be part of the main museum system of our country, which is the Smithsonian. They are noted for having the best museums. They also are noted for traveling museums. We want our museum to go around to every state and tell the story across the country, and excellent archivists and historians that can work to study and come up with what needs to be in the museum. The commission had a number of really great women. They're probably all on this call, and they unanimously concluded that the U.S. needs and absolutely deserves a comprehensive museum dedicated to the contributions women have made in shaping this country. And that includes women of every background, every profession, since the founding of our nation. And I finally came down with this major premise that how can we empower women with the Equal Rights Amendment and other powers that we need for childcare and work-family balance and so forth? How can we empower women if we do not even recognize them and we do not recognize their achievements? So I see the Women's Museum as part of the steps towards women's equality, the ERA, equal pay for equal work, recognizing the great scientists, the great educators that have made this country great. And I have an own special project that I work on now, and that is that I try to pass legislation honoring women that have been forgotten. And just last year, I passed a bill with Senator Gillibrand to rename the Manhattan VA the Margaret Cochran Corbin campus of the New York Harbor Healthcare System, which would make it the first VA hospital to be named for a woman veteran. And it was named for Margaret Corbin, who was born in 1751 and accompanied her husband into the Revolutionary War and supported his efforts. He was killed when he was fighting. She then picked up the cannon and continued to fight. She was injured, she cooked, she cleaned, she fought. And on November 16th, 1776, she took her husband's place at the Battle of Fort Washington in Manhattan after he was fatally wounded, where she was then shot and wounded. And in recognition of her service and injuries, Corbin was awarded a lifelong pension, making her the first woman to receive a pension from the United States through military service. And unfortunately, she's just one of the many women whose stories have been forgotten. Now, I know a lot of you are historians. If you have women you think we should name something of in Congress, I'm your girl. I'll get it done. So let's start naming things for women. Let's start putting them not only in the museum, but everywhere where they deserve to be. It took 16 years to do that. And then once they came back and said we needed it, I then put in another bill and we pushed it forward. And Susan Collins was my partner in the Senate. And we finally got it passed this past December. I was just absolutely so thrilled that it's now the law of the land. I do want to mention that Lonnie Bunch, who is now the secretary of the Smithsonian, was extremely helpful. Some of the secretaries did not support the museum. So it's very hard to get the museum in the Smithsonian if the head of the Smithsonian is saying, no, I don't want it. It started out that we had such a opposition that I said, we'll pay for everything. All we want is recognition that we deserve a museum on the mall. We will do all the work. We're used to doing that. And Lonnie said, no, it has to be half government. I'm glad that he put that in the bill and insisted on it because it's now passed. He estimates that it will cost $250 million for the federal government, $250 million for the private. We are on our way and I'm thrilled about it. Now, as other speakers, probably Wendy and others will say, that in the report of the commission, they said it should be on the mall. And I want to underscore this because it's not over till it's over. And I think we all have to have a sharp pencil to make sure it ends up on the mall and it will make our fundraising easier. The commission came back with 3 locations. One was at the end of the mall, across from the African American Museum. That site is perfect for us. Another was part of another building. The Latino Museum has claimed that space. The other was the parking lot of the Senate. Well, I can tell you what they said about the idea of their parking lot going to the Women's Museum. They say that's a non-starter. So we have our spot, that's the only one left, and that's at the end across from the African American Museum. Now, the problem is that this bill says that they have 2 years to decide on the site. I hope that in those 2 years, they don't decide to move the women off the mall. So I think we should have our press conferences and our meetings on our site on the mall going forward. And I also think we should start collecting collections from Gloria Steinem, from Ellie Smeal, from the family of Margaret Corbin, of anything we can find from some of these historic women to put in our museum. Now, the passage of the bill is a great step forward, but you will be hearing an update today from Susan Whiting and Holly Hotchner of the National Women's History Museum. Now, this is an organization that has been doing this important work for years, and they operate a website or a virtual museum celebrating women throughout our history and stories of women that deserve a spotlight. And we are half the population. We've been in the center of everything positive that's happened in this nation, and we should be recognized for it. I want to say how important the National Women's History Museum is. When I started on this effort, they were the group that backed my work. And this was the group that worked to get the women out of the basement and into the rotunda of the Capitol. Have you heard that story? I had to put in a bill for that. That took 4 years to get the women out of the basement and into the rotunda. This year I have a bill to put the inscription on it that they took off. It said, women empowered with a vote will speak up and have their true courage and recognition achieved. They took it off and called it blasphemous. I think we deserve it back on that historical monument, don't you think? And we had to work really hard to get that passed. I have to tell you the story. We had a woman in the women's meeting room, the Lindy Boggs room, and I was telling the women members of Congress that I'd finally gotten Newt Gingrich to say, yes, we're going to be able to move the women out of the basement into the rotunda with Lincoln and Jefferson and Washington and all of our great leaders. And one of my female friends from the Republican side came rushing into the room and said, we can't move the statue. I said, why? She said, well, the Republicans just had a meeting and they said that the women were too ugly and that we should move in a more attractive statue. The great Patricia Schroeder, not missing a beat, said, have you looked at Lincoln recently? Obviously, our women were not going into the rotunda. I think they're beautiful, but they were going in for their achievements, which was why all the men were there. I just say these stories about how ridiculously hard this has been. This should have been like having a cup of coffee in the morning, but it was a huge, huge fight. And it's been and continues to be a huge fight. So we're going to have to keep working on it. So that is part of it. I think that all our young girls and boys deserve to learn the stories like Margaret Corbin's and be inspired them for generations to come. That is what this museum is going to do. And we have a lot of work ahead. The Smithsonian leadership is first focused on hiring a core group of staff to shepherd the project through. A few weeks ago, the Smithsonian announced the appointment of Lisa Sasiski. She is the interim director of the museum. She has a wealth of experience and will be in charge of getting preparations for the museum up and running right away. Additionally, there will be a 25-member advisory council that will be appointed by the Smithsonian in the next few months to help guide us. And they say over 2 years, a site selection study has to be done. I feel like the study has already been done, that we should just be pushing this forward now. And we need to make clear that we belong on the mall. I've been encouraged by people very excited about giving and supporting it. Now with the executive director, hopefully they can create a bank account. We can all work on it. The bill says that the construction funding for the museum will be 50% federally appropriate, 50% privately raised, and the operations and maintenance costs will come from federal funds, which will be great. And that'll be the curators and the historians and everyone. And I will be working in Congress to make sure the Smithsonian has the funding that it deserves. It's my #1 funding request. We all get our request list. It's #1 for the museum. And a few years later, we should start making it happen and building it. I'm even more eager to celebrate with you when the Smithsonian Women's History Museum opens its doors, and the stories it will tell will inspire women and men of all ages for generations to come. Again, it takes a village. I see so many faces of people that worked with us, that helped us make this happen. I do serve on the Financial Services Committee, and we have the first woman Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, testifying, and I'm going to have to ask her questions about important priorities that I believe she should be focusing on. So I have to run to that event. I'd rather be with you. Christina Parisi will be taking notes and letting me know what else I can do to help your efforts to move it forward. I think we should start collecting items for the museum and giving them to the Smithsonian and having them dedicated on our site, on the mall. And I have a hope that a lot of our living heroines will give to it. Tomorrow, this is interesting. Tomorrow, I'm having a hearing on pay gap. And one of the biggest areas of pay gap is the women in soccer. And one of their big soccer fans is going to be testifying. I'm going to ask for her testimony to go into the Women's Museum, along with her award-winning outfit when she scored the most goals in history of a woman in the sport of soccer, but is paid 38% less than the male counter. And they didn't even win they don't even win, and they get paid 38% more than the women who actually won. So the fight continues. I hope you'll join me tomorrow at my hearing on pay inequity as we work for many areas for women. Again, I thank this organization and your leadership for making this happen. If there is any questions, I'd be glad to answer 1 or 2 right now, or let you go on with your program. Again, it's good to see Susan and Wendy and so many of you that have worked on this, and Sue Klein and all of you that have worked so hard on this to make it happen, and Connie Cordovilla. So Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That's fantastic. And thank you for all your wonderful leadership on women's issues and many more, including DC statehood from the hearing yesterday. Now we will go to Wendy Pangram to hear more about how the commission helped get this going again. Wendy, all yours.
Okay. All right, for some reason, you all, my camera is not working, so you're seeing me on my laptop right now. I've never had this happen before, but I just wanted to give a little, first of all, thanks for inviting me. And I really wanted to talk a little bit about, Carolyn really laid out the groundwork beautifully on what we're doing, what we did for the commission. But I wanted, maybe Connie, that slide that I sent you, you could pull up for me. If that works. Because I wanted to everybody, a lot of people don't understand what the commission was tasked with doing. So that's beautiful. Thank you. So what happened is, as Carolyn said, we had 8 commissioners that were nominated by Congress, and we started our task of number 1, the threshold question of whether America needs, deserves a museum that is dedicated to women's history. And if that was the case, then we would have to answer in our report the following 9 questions. So first of all, I'll tell you that the absolute hardest part about this job when I took over as executive director was that, unlike some of the other museum commissions, the African American, Latino, they were given about $3 million to put this report together. The Women's History Museum got $0. So probably the hardest hurdle that we had to go over first was, how do we get started? And thankfully to Susan Whiting and her group with the National Women's History Museum, they provided the seed money for us to get this report going. And then we really relied on volunteers and vendors that did in-kind donations, scholars from across the country. So really it was an amazing community effort to get this thing put together. But after we determined, yes, we need a museum, then we were tasked with the following 9 things, and I'm just going to go very quickly. Number 1, the big question was after that was, should it be part of the Smithsonian? And the Smithsonian and the commissioners really decided it was either we were going big or we were going home. So absolutely, we are important enough to be part of the nation's museum as the Smithsonian. So that was a yes. And then we were offering we studied a lot of of governance structures and what kind of structure would be best for a women's history museum and how to make it inclusive. Then we had to look at the cost and availability of collections around the country. We worked with many, many museums and nonprofits across the country to figure out what they had in their coffers in terms of collections. And then the other one was best practices on engaging women in the development and design of the museum, but also engaging difference of opinion too. And this has got to be a very bipartisan effort with lots of different viewpoints. So that was very important. And we had focus groups from across the country come together to try to get us as much information as possible. And then the calculating the impact of some regional museums. Some people thought, well, who's going to go to our museum anymore if there's a National Women's History Museum? Well, the information, there's so much of it, and it's so good that we thought, no, we should be sort of the central sort of point to help our national museum, our regional museums throughout the country. Carolyn mentioned a location. Now, we did pinpoint 3 really beautiful locations on or very close proximity to the mall. But at the end of the day, when the legislation was passed, this goes, and Julissa will, I'm sure, follow up on this. This is now the location is now in the hands of both the Smithsonian and the government. But we did come up with some very good options at the time. Thank you. And then the next thing is we had to come with the fundraising feasibility study. Carolyn mentioned that probably now we'll have to raise about $250 million in private sector money, but we felt that we could do that quite easily. Not easily, there's no easy way to raise money, but we could do that. And then let's see, where's our next, I'm missing my last two. There we go. Maybe just do the full slide. And maybe you guys could take a photo of this or a snapshot. The cost of construction, we talked to architects and museum experts on, how do you go about building a museum? And then we went on to determining a legislative plan of attack. And before we get off the slide, I just wanted to, I said, well, I should put a visual on this thing. And at first I said, oh, we can put the normal, women's suffrage photo up there or something like that. But I thought, no, this whole museum is more about just the story of the right to vote. It's a much bigger picture. And the Smithsonian has a fabulous book that they've came out with about a year or 2 years ago. Everybody should have this on their coffee table. And it's the Smithsonian American Women book. And it has got fabulous stories and highlights of all these things that they have collected throughout the years, that they'll be ready once we have the physical museum up and running to be able to put all of that together. And it's really a fabulous book. So treat yourself. And I also put the Smithsonian's website on there because a lot of people ask me all the time, well, how do I get involved and what do we do next, Wendy? And I say all roads should go through the Smithsonian. And if you see the Women's History website, you should sign up. And they will put you on a mailing list so you're up to date with all of the programs that I'm sure Julissa's going to talk about. And then they also, if you so inclined to help them start putting money in the coffers for the effort, that would be the website. And they do have a donation sort of place to donate as well. So I'll finish on that slide and I'll just tell you a little bit about and again, I'm sorry I'm crooked today, but what happened is after the Smithsonian completed its report, we took it up to the Congress and President Obama, then our job was formally over. But these 8 ladies, the commissioners said, well, wait a minute, our job isn't over. What else do we get to do? So we worked we worked really hard with the Smithsonian for all of these years to create a women's history initiative within the institution to start the Smithsonian to get lots of programs all throughout their Smithsonian. I'm sure Julissa will mention this, but that was a real a big breakthrough for us. So we weren't just a commission that went away. And also I'm very proud of the commission because we raised the first $3 million in seed money to fund the Smithsonian's initiative. So it was actually a live thing right after we finished the report. So the commissioners are still very, very involved. And as Carolyn says, now the fund starts raising the money. Half has to come from the private sector. The site selection, the design of a building, creating, more importantly, the vision, the storyline, the exhibits that tell the story of American contributions. So the commissioners are still very involved. We have women on the advisory board at the Smithsonian, and the commissioners are just sort of standing by, ready to get to the next step. So I want to thank you all for bearing with me and looking at me sideways.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Now, Holly or Susan, who's next from the National Women's History Museum?
I think I'm going to jump in first, and then Holly's going to follow, and we'll try to split our time really fairly. First of all, thank you for having us. This is so exciting to be here talking about the history of this history museum, but also, how all these different organizations really do have a common appreciation of the need for all of us to understand better women's contributions to American history. And so I'm the chair of the National Women's History Museum Board, and came to that about 6 years ago, right after the legislation had passed to create the commission. And, it's great to hear Congresswoman Maloney talk about the history of her involvement, which is really very much the timeline of the National Women's History Museum. So Karen Stazer and a group of other people, some of you may be actually on this call, started this based on moving that portrait statue to celebrate. They wanted it out of the basement to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And as a result of how difficult that was and what was required, came up at the kitchen table, as many things happen, with the idea of this museum, the National Women's History Museum. But because of the work that was ahead to get a physical location, they made the very smart decision to be available and accessible online. So today, so the museum and its board and its supporters, many of you are supporters, spent a lot of its time, energy on lobbying and legislating and trying to get that building on the mall, but also contributing daily to our knowledge of women's contributions to our history by having the website. And I'm happy to say that we are the leading website and location for women's history because of that foresight they had. And particularly in 2020, when it was such a difficult year and still continues to be, the ability for this small but mighty band, I call it, of educators and historians and writers to provide really wonderful content and to convene discussions around the 100th anniversary of the getting out the vote, meant we had a programming year like no other. Not knowing about what would happen with the legislation several years ago, after the different report, the commission's report came forward, we made the decision to continue doing all of the educational work we do because we knew there was demand. We actually did. I was the vice chair of Nielsen. I know research well. We did research among men and women across the country to solidify the demand for this information and make sure people really wanted such a museum and a source of information, and overwhelmingly they did. And you've heard that several times, but it is true, it continues to be true. But what's really exciting about, I think, what we've seen over the last several years in particular is our reach right now in all 50 states in a 24-hour-a-day, accessible, free for the most part, source of information about women's contributions, is that we have over 4 million visitors to our website. 4 million. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of social media engagements. This year, the attention to women's history is greater than it's ever been. We've done some really fun things. I'll let Holly talk about that, to continue both to get attention to women's history, but also to build the outreach and the scholarly backing. So we reach all kinds of people all over the United States every day. And, just in Women's History Month, we're about 1.5 million visitors so far this month. Those are numbers that matter. They make an impact. And I'm so excited that we've been able to do what we've been able to do. And as we go forward, we intend to continue in areas where we can interact with teachers and schools and lesson plans and draw attention to what we need to do to bring those stories forward around the country and make them accessible to everybody. And we're collaborating with people all over, also institutions, organizations, universities. That's one of the advantages we've seen of being online, and even in a pandemic, of pulling people together across the country on topics Holly can talk about. But we do also want to be in a place where we can convene people for conversations and build that around topics that are current. And we're going to be doing that. And we are working with different people to have that opportunity to be in a place while we're collaborating. So it's actually, I think, one of the most exciting moments in our organization's history. And we're so excited to have, supported the commission's work in kind and in dollars so that they could actually go forward and create that report. So our members are very excited that we're at this place, and we're excited that we're continuing to make a big impact. So stay tuned as we continue to do that. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to our CEO, Holly Hotchner, who joined us several years ago as a very experienced museum director and let her update you on what's next.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. So I guess I have been with the museum for 2 years and was brought in to create actual exhibitions and physical programming for the museum and to move it to be not just a virtual museum, but a physical museum, which we are in the process of doing. I think, as you heard, and I'm sure Carolyn Maloney would say this and has said this, there would be no bill if it was not for the National Women's History Museum. It was a very big part of the history of what we spent our time and fundraising working on. And I do think it's also important to note that while we are so happy that this bill has passed, there was no funding associated with the bill. So the $250 million of government funding is not approved or appropriated. That's going to be a whole other step. And obviously we hope that can be achieved, but it's quite an important point. So next year in 2022, we will be creating physical exhibits and programming in Washington, D.C. But I think one of the things that's very important to add to what Susan said is what's been accomplished over these years and what we intend to continue doing over however many years it takes to get this the Smithsonian Museum up and running and actually built. We have a 21-person scholarly advisory group with some of the great women's historians in this country that work with us on a regular basis to produce extraordinary work and to give lectures for us and to sit in symposia on our behalf and so on. We've created more than 200 original biographies over these last years, which are worked on by our fellows and our staff and in some cases the advisory group. Just this last month, we did 50 virtual exhibit tours, which is a huge number and served a really large public. I think that Susan mentioned that we have 55,000 members, which is charter members, who have stayed with us all these years. And they, of course, want a virtual museum, but they are very, very dedicated to the kind of work that we do. They use our programming. We have a tremendous number of programs that we produce every week, and a tremendous number of online exhibits that now will become real exhibits as well. I believe we have done something like 50 exhibits over the years. So there is a very, very large history, and I think it's a little misleading to say there is no Women's History Museum, because certainly we're here and carrying the torch. We are supported mostly by private donations, but also some of the federal endowments. And we are growing our staff. I think there's a tremendous need for all the work in women's history that can be done to keep a visibility on why we're interested in not only the Smithsonian Museum, but any more institutions to join in creating interest in women's history. Carolyn certainly is correct that it's crazy there isn't a women's history museum on the Mall, but it's also crazy that there isn't one in the United States anywhere else. When you think about the fact that there are probably, I don't know, many hundreds of contemporary art museums, many thousands of modern art museums, let's say, in this country, and there was not a single women's history museum. So we think there's an enormous amount for all of us to be doing. We are partnering with a number of universities who have collections. We have a small collection. We haven't decided how to grow our collection at the moment, but there's a terrific need for so many of the collections that exist in historic houses and historical societies and all kinds of repositories to see the light of day, because most of these collections are never seen. And my goal is to work nationally around the country, specifically to help communities uncover their own history, their own women's history. I think communities are very interested in the heroes, the sheroes in their backyard. To do this original research, we can help them figure out how to do that. And I think that can be one of our main leadership roles. And just to finish, for example, this last year, we tripled our audience because we are virtual. So luckily we knew how to deliver virtual programming in this terrible time. But we started a women's writing history project where we put out a call to any woman to give us their journals during this during the coronavirus time. And we're overwhelmed with the response. We collect all over the world, not just in this country. So we have some amazing work from many countries around the world. But the main thing is to the power of these stories. And we own the journals. We have made a commitment to archive them. They will be going up digitized online starting in 2 weeks. So we are very much in the world of digitizing and collections management. And the power of these women from all walks of life are quite extraordinary. And I think capturing contemporary history is something that's going to be very important to our museum. So we will, I'm seeing some of you would like the scholarly advisory. Sure, it should be on the website. We've just rebranded ourselves, and Paula Scher of Pentagram, one of the great leading female designers in a field where there are very few, has done the branding. We will be rolling it out at the end of the month. We are completely redoing our website, so forgive us if some things are a little hard to find at the moment. I think you will be astonished with the quality of the people who are working with us. So that's just a taste of what we're doing. We did an amazing symposium series last year on the occasion of the 19th Amendment anniversary. It went to 9 cities. We are publishing it, and there will be, I think, an incredible record of what we learned in that year and were able to create. We had series at the Newberry Library in Chicago, various universities. We moved all around the country with the theme, and it was really fascinating. And we will, as I say, we are working on a publication right at this moment. So anyone who would like to ask questions or get involved, we are womenshistory.org, and anyone can reach me. I don't know a lot of you, I would love to. And we have, tremendous interest in working with every organization that's interested in women's history.
Thank you so much, Holly and Susan. Now we get to hear some of the actual legislative first starts from Julissa Marenco and of the Smithsonian. And Julissa has multiple titles. She's the Assistant Secretary for Communications and External Affairs and Chief Marketing Officer for the Smithsonian. And we were pleased to hear that Congresswoman Maloney said Lonnie Bunch was a great supporter of the museum. And so Julissa, I'm sure, works closely with him. So it's all yours. Thank you, Julissa.
Sue, thank you so much. And thank you very much for the kind invitation, not just to the Smithsonian, but of my person as well. And thank you for the kind introduction. So I, in addition to serving as Assistant Secretary and Chief Marketing Officer, I always like to say I have the longest possible title. I don't know if at times it's as reflective of the amount of work or not, if you will, but I will take it as such. I also had the tremendous opportunity to serve as a commissioner for the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission last year in anticipation of the Suffrage Centennial, the 19th Amendment, which was a terrific experience and really afforded me an opportunity to meet a lot of folks that are present here today, as well as different colleagues across the country. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, last summer, the Forward into Light project, which was the project that lit up well over 100 buildings across the country in purple and yellow in celebration of the Suffrage Centennial. The commission was charged with the celebration efforts for Congress and for the administration to look into in celebration of the 19th Amendment. It was a terrific commission, did terrific work. You know, prior to starting, I'm happy to provide you with an update as to where we are at the Smithsonian. I'd like to take a moment just to really echo some of the sentiment and some of the comments that have been made. First, starting with the incredible work of Rep. Maloney. I knew that she had been at this for such a long time, but I didn't realize it was down to back to the late 1990s. She's really been an advocate, I would say, not just for this museum, but for the Smithsonian in total. We have 19 museums across our institution, and she's always been someone that we can rely upon, who's just a great voice to be with us. I'd also like to recognize the work of my fellow panelists here in this virtual setting. I'm very cognizant of the work that has been done by Holly, by Wendy, and by Susan to get us this far. And we really are appreciative. And I do believe that the Smithsonian benefits because of your leadership and what you've been able to do. So thank you. And then last but not least, I'm happy to see some friends and some other leaders from women organizations like Amy and Julissa here present with us today. It's terrific to see you all here. So thank you. So let me just give you by way of an update. You've heard a little bit from Rep. Maloney as to where we are. It's important to, the legislation got passed in December, and since then we've really hit the ground running. I'd like to somewhat manage expectations, if you will, with regards to timeline, because I think there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, and I always feel that I'm the person that is kind of saying, well, let me tell you how long a journey it is. It's been a long journey, but I most certainly will continue to be a long journey just the same. But I think, at the Smithsonian, this is an opportunity for us to tell more diverse stories and inspire the American people through different lenses. And it's something that we do well. It's something that we take great pride in, that we have the skill and expertise to develop these world-class museums from our exceptional staff and talent, but really to build historic and engaging collections, programs, and exhibitions. And so in December, when the legislation passed, and as most of you all folks might know, we had two museums that were passed. So the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, as well as the National Museum of the American Latino. Since December, there's a couple of steps that Rep. Maloney spoke to earlier that the legislation dictates and kind of sets the timeline for us, if you will, for us to begin the process of developing the museum. One of the first and key and most instrumental steps that we have taken, which Rep. Maloney also referenced, has been appointing an interim director for the Women's History Museum, and it's our colleague, Lisa Sasaki. If you know Lisa, you know how very lucky we are to have her step up to this position in these interim years. As you can imagine, the first years are formative, are very important. Lisa is a leader within the institution. She serves as the head of the American Asian Pacific Center. Not only is she a leader for her respective center, but additionally so, she's a leader for the institution. This is not the first time that we've asked her to step into a role that helps with either a transition or an interim basis. Previously, last year, she served as the interim director of the Anacostia Community Museum when it was in transition. Most recently, she was also a leader as part of our New Normal Committee task force, which was charged with looking at life in a post-pandemic world in museums and at the Smithsonian. And she was one of the leaders that served on this. So she's a strong player for the Smithsonian. I think A, we're very lucky that she was asked to serve in this interim capacity, but B, we're even luckier that she decided to accept to serve in this interim capacity, because I think the museum will benefit from her expertise, not just Smithsonian, but just as a museum professional. So one of our most important steps was in appointing her. She's hit the ground running, and I look forward for her to have an opportunity to meet you just the same, hopefully in the future. Additionally, so just for folks who might be interested, we also named an interim director for the Latino Museum, Eduardo Diaz, who currently serves as the Smithsonian Latino Center director. Again, both of these are dynamic, thoughtful leaders. So the process is really in good hands on both fronts. Eventually, we will be leading a national search for the museum to find the first founding director for the museum. Again, we hope to be able to provide more information as that process develops. One of the items that the legislation dictates to the institution is to establish an advisory council 6 months from the institution, which would be June 26th of 2021. So it being today, March, we're really in the middle of that process. We're in the early stages of putting together what that potential council might look like. Some organizations have been kind enough to send us names of people for us to consider, so we really do appreciate that. We are in that process as we speak. I think Rep. Maloney indicated there's a total of about 25 council members that the legislation dictates, 6 of which will be appointed by Congress and by members of the Smithsonian Board of Regents, which leaves us with 19 seats to fill. Those seats are then appointed by the Smithsonian Board of Regents. I see someone just put in the chat that we should, who should we send names to? You know what, my colleague, and actually I should pause with that just the same. I'm joined today by 2 of my exceptional colleagues. One is Carrie Brady, and hopefully she'll forgive me for sharing her email, but I think she won't. We'll put it in the chat. If you would like to send some names for consideration, please feel free to send them to Carrie Brady. I also saw that we were also joined by Stephanie Steebage, my terrific colleague who's the head of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Would like to just say hi to her. She actually also co-chairs the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative, just a terrific leader for our institution, just the same. So the board, so the members of the council recommendations will be made. The Board of Regents will have final say as to what this council looks like. But again, Congress has dictated our deadline, if you will, which will be June of 2021. And we're working directly towards that timeline. The other element that the legislation has indicated that provides us a timeline just the same, Representative Maloney spoke to, was that of the site selection. And as she indicated rightly so, the site selection is due to be, according to the legislation, we have to have the site selection completed by December 2022, 2 years from when the legislation was established. So from last year, December 20 to December 2022. I would argue that in addition to the director of the museum, one of the most important and consequential decisions for any museum is really the site. It's somewhat of a lifetime commitment to a museum, if you will. And so earlier this year, we kicked off the site selection process. And what that means, simply stated, is we request from architectural firms for proposals to conduct an evaluation of sites. Some of the sites that Representative Maloney mentioned, as well as additional sites, just to kind of get a lay of the land, if you will. If there's any architects on the line, they most certainly can speak to this much more heavily than I could. But it is a process that is an important process because it allows us to identify which sites might be best suited. It allows us to identify for elements that we just might not be familiar with. So we're in the process of reviewing the different firms that submitted proposals with the hopes of being able to select a firm in the late spring or early summer. After that, then the site selection firm will then begin that evaluation process. And that evaluation process is quite extensive. Again, this being one of the most consequential decisions for any museum, it's important that that process has the ability to be able to really look at different questions and different aspects of that process so that we can end up with the best site possible. The other element that we've been heavily working on, just the same, and actually, Wendy earlier mentioned this and had a great image of our book, so thank you for that, Wendy. Our American Women's History Initiative. So when Wendy served as executive director of the commission and the commissioners, we are beyond indebted to these commissioners because some of the work that they did really has helped us. And one of their recommendations, in addition to the recommendation of a museum, but one of the recommendations that this commission put forth was for the Smithsonian to lead with a Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative, predating any kind of a museum. Their recommendation was the Smithsonian should be looking into and developing an initiative. It's important to note the difference between the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative and an actual museum. The work of the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative is, I think, just as important. And I will tell you why, having been part of the leadership of this effort. And as I mentioned, my colleague, Stephanie Stevich, who has served as co-chair for this initiative, would also speak to it. The goal of the initiative, not the singular goal, but the main goal of the initiative is really to ensure that women's history stories are being told across the institution, across our 19 museums. This is very important because, as you can imagine, there are different stories to be, one of the things when we look at, the best example that we will continue to look at for as we build this new museum is the most recent museum that's been built, which is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, right? And I spoke earlier to the timeline. It's important to note that that museum, from the day the legislation was passed to the day the doors open, was a 13-year journey. One of the things that we were astutely aware of was just because we had a museum now in African American history and culture did not mean then that other museums weren't going to have collections, exhibits, programming about African American history. Similarly, just the same here. Just because we are building a museum, that does not mean that then other museums should not make this a priority. Again, women represent the majority of this country, so it would be irresponsible of us as an institution to not ensure that that representation is across all of our museums. As Representative Maloney rightly pointed out, we have women's leadership in science, right? There should be greater presence at our Natural History Museum, at our Air and Space Museum, just the same in our art world, at our Portraiture Museum. And so the Women's History Initiative was charged with just that. How do we amplify women's voices? How do we reach diverse audiences? And how do we empower the stories of women across our institution? I'm happy to report that despite the challenges posed by the pandemic, and it most certainly has been challenging, this initiative, now going into its 5th year, has had remarkable success over the past years. Some of you may be familiar with, some of our recent exhibitions. Last fall, the National Museum of American History opened Girlhood, It's Complicated. If you haven't heard it, I encourage you to go see it. It really is a terrific exhibit, terrific just ability to tell stories, right? Before from a storytelling, to be able to see the role of girls on the front lines of social change throughout American history in this exhibit has been something that has not just been inspiring, but has been a way of engaging with young women, with different women of different generations, bringing them together into the environment, either at the museum, hopefully when we'll be in person, but most certainly from a virtual perspective. We actually held a virtual opening night. It was great to see some of you all there in October. The event was attended by over 700 people, artists, musicians, young women, all across the board. And the exhibition will continue to be hosted at the museum for the next 2 years, after which it will then travel from 2023 to 2025. And again, these are some of the efforts that the initiative has supported throughout the institution, right? Girlhood was a initiative supported by the American Women's History Initiative. Another exhibit that we opened last November, just the same, encourage you to see it online as well as in person once we're reopened, was this past November, we opened Every Eye is Upon Me, First Ladies of the United States at the National Portrait Gallery. This is the first major exhibition to explore the historical significance of First Ladies through the art of portraiture. Just a beautiful, stunning, visually appealing exhibition, which I encourage you to visit just the same. One of the items that the Women's History Initiative has really created a sea change at the institution has been the focus on curators, right? Our curators are storytellers, our curators are looking at exhibitions, looking at collections, looking to tell the stories of women. And so one of the things that this initiative has been especially important has been just that, allowing us to hire curators across the institution. Currently, we have 9 women's history curators spread out throughout the institution. So if you could imagine, irrespective of a museum, these individuals, their job is to look for those stories that they want to amplify about women's history across all of our different museums, irrespective of what the subject is, which is the way to have impact within our institution, right, is through those exhibits, through those collections, through what people are coming to see. Lastly, the other effort that the American Women's History Initiative has continued to have an impact upon has been through creating a cohort of interns. We were able to welcome our first class of interns actually maybe 2 years ago. Last year, we transitioned to virtual because of the obvious current situation, and this year will also be virtual. But throughout this cohort, this has been a very, very popular program. If you have any young women in your life, I highly encourage you to send them our way. Applications are actually taking place right now. This year, we received over 800 applications for, unfortunately, only 12 spots. We're looking to grow that cohort just the same, but this really does give undergraduate and graduate students hands-on experience in a museum as they practice and are able to learn about historical research, also combined with close mentorship. The cohort has become so strong within the institution that it's actually competitive to get mentors for these individuals within the institution. And so mentors at the institution have to explain why they would be great mentors for these young women. Again, encourage, if you have folks, it's an 8-week virtual internship for 2021. And again, they get exposure to women's history across the institution. Wendy kindly showed the book that we just, that book that of Smithsonian American Women is also another direct result of the American Women's History Initiative. Through the initiative, we were able to create this book that looked at objects and collections from across the institution, telling stories of women throughout the institution, but also a lot of stories, I would say, that haven't been as told or haven't been at the forefront of some of our history books. So with that, I will take a pause. I can't stress enough how happy I am to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to see some of you all, as well as to meet some new faces. And thank you again for the kind invitation. Sue, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Julissa. Now we'd like to give a brief opportunity for the presenters to ask each other any burning questions, and then we'll open it up to other attendees. Any presenters want to speak up? No?
I guess I have, it's Holly. I guess I have a point of view that every institution should be doing a better job about presenting women's history. And, it is a question why the Smithsonian and every other museum or many other history museums in this country haven't, with their own curators, been looking at women's history, and why it takes an overlay really for institutions that should represent certainly women and all kinds of diversity. And I think the people at the top, and this is happening everywhere, I'm a New Yorker in New York as well, it's not about the Smithsonian, but why does it take an overlay and raising so much more money to get institutions really to be focusing on what they should be doing? And this isn't necessarily a question, it's just a point. I think every institution needs to take diversity very seriously, and many institutions are focusing on women's history without a women's history initiative. So, it is another major expense, it's another major effort to put together, and I think it's wonderful that you've been able to achieve some things, but I think all curators should be looking at women's history. It's just a comment. It's not meant to be.
No. I
feel strongly about that. So, and I've been involved with many, many other museums that are taking this very seriously without creating a separate, whole other funding thing and initiative.
I appreciate the comment. And I failed to mention earlier, and Rep Maloney rightly stated, we are so very lucky at this moment in time to have, for those of you who may know him or for those of you who don't, to have Secretary Bunch as our secretary. If you know him, you know why we're lucky. If you don't know him, his focus on the increase in the impact of stories being told from all different lenses is kind of something he's really dedicated his career and his life to, if you will. I think, it's important to know, and I failed to mention this, the American Women's History Initiative was something that as I mentioned earlier, the commission kindly recommended to the institution. This is not to say that we weren't covering women's history before. We most certainly were. This obviously afforded us to expand upon that. And then I should add, Congress then dictated by investing appropriations and funding for us to do this effort just the same. And as a result, allowed us to amplify our efforts. Thank you.
I just have sort of a follow-up question. Holly had mentioned that you have some non-virtual exhibits ready to go, and I was wondering if they're going to be displayed at the Smithsonian or where. And also I remember a few months ago, you had discussed the possibility of establishing some non-virtual exhibits at the Martin Luther King Library in DC. Could you fill us in on what's going on there?
I can't actually, because we are just in the process of finalizing our arrangement, so I'm not at liberty to say exactly where we're going to be. One of the things that we've done in the last couple of years, we looked at Union Station very seriously 1 year ago, looked at 40,000 square feet in the station to start doing programming. That, when COVID started, fell apart, but we are very close to announcing where we're going to be, and it's a wonderful location, and we have 5 years of exhibitions that we're planning and hiring curators and so forth. So sorry that I can't be more direct. I'm not trying to be coy, but we will be announcing it when our partner is available to talk about it as well. I believe very strongly in partnerships, as do many museums and so forth. And I think sharing resources is a wonderful way to be able to proceed, especially post-COVID, when so many museums have been impacted negatively financially and because of visitation and so forth. And for us not to have to build a building right now, I think is a wonderful way forward. And I think it is, whoever said at the beginning of this that $250 million will be easy to raise, we'll all try, but raising money for women's history has been very difficult. We've been in that zone for 25 years, and it's changing, but it's still a very big challenge. So we're looking forward to everyone helping. So.
Holly, you might add, I think the reference perhaps to physical collection relates to the journal project, and we have 1,400 people contributing, right? And we are digitizing all of that.
Any of the other presenters like to interact? If not, Denise had submitted in advance some questions. Do you have a key question that you'd like to ask folks right now?
I think the major question is I'd really like to know what the vision is for women's history. One of the most troubled museums that's on the mall has been the history of the Native American. It was founded, if you know the history, in a very unique way and under urgency. It didn't start with a vision. And when you start that way, it is challenging what's to be included because the devil's in the details. So I'm interested in what your vision for women's history is. No one has established this. The commission, which I followed closely, did not. The National Women's History Museum has actually fired some scholars in the past, and there's been no public presentation of what themes they've identified. So I'd really like to know what kinds of vision do you see that's going to make this a truly historic museum, which is what all of us really wish for. So I'm kind of curious, and what makes it different, for example, from a Hall of Fame? We have women's Hall of Fames, we have specialized ones, we have a national one. The National Women's History Project has done a lot of this, work on that. So I'm curious what makes this different, pretty much like Gerda Lerner's idea. Let's get beyond compensating and notable women and talk about how women have worked together to achieve big historic ends. So I'm curious what everyone's vision is and how you're going to make that something that people can respond to and engage with as the museum's being built. And as you go out to identify exhibits and artifacts, which I think Lonnie Bunch did over 2,000 focus groups and met and went to individual homes. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it needs a vision. So if everyone could share what your vision is, that would be wonderful, because I've yet to see this. Thank you.
Julissa, would you like to take the first crack at that?
Sure, happy to. I appreciate the question, Denise. Thank you so much. If you've heard our secretary speak to this topic, the answer in the most straightforward way, it's obviously evolving. One of the reasons that he specifically moved so quickly to name an interim and has charged the leadership team, of which I'm a part of, to move forward with the national search for a director, is to answer that exact question that you've posited. He will be the first to tell you and share how important it was to have the leadership of the museum established, because he wanted the individual who would own this and who would evolve the vision and articulate the vision for the museum. So it's a little bit too early for us to share it from a Smithsonian perspective. I think once we have that leadership in place, that leader will then hopefully create what that design looks like. What are the stories that we're looking to tell? What does that programming look like? And that is part of the leadership team for the museum. So I would be a little bit ahead of myself if I were to say, and this is what we see. But I will tell you that it's an important question that we are most certainly exploring within the institution, because it's such an important detail that the leadership will be able to formulate. If I could just provide a little bit kind of back of the envelope timeline, if you will, when the African American History Museum was built, the site selection process, as we've indicated, will take us through the first 2 years. But then after that, there is pre-design, full design, construction. When we move into exhibitions and programming is significantly later on down the line. However, that thinking, to have that formative thinking in the beginning, will be helpful, so that eventually when you get to the latter years of the building of the museum, that has been fused throughout the building. So again, from our perspective, it's a little bit too early for us to be able to say, and this is what we see, but please note that it's a topic that is of prominent importance to us. Thank you.
Any of the other presenters like to comment on the question?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in, Sue, if it's all right. I think one of the important things that Julissa just sort of touched on is that with the commission, it was very important to the commissioners, and it is in the report, that it said that this is not just a movie star kind of thing. It's movie stars and, famous people, but a lot of women's history throughout America has really been about the stories of everyday people, and almost also groups of women, the farming community, what women did during particularly some of the wars. So it's really about these amazing stories of and I think what's a lot of fun about, it's going to be a lot of fun about this museum, is that these stories that you just have never heard. So it's a lot about unsung heroes and people that it never occurred to you in your wildest dreams would do some of these amazing things and change the course of history. And we also want to make sure that this is not just a museum and this was again highlighted in the commission report, that it's not just for an organization, I mean, a museum for women. It's for girls and boys and men and anybody else, any diverse category that you can think of, and also for visitors coming from outside the United States. So it's really very much the success of the African American Museum has been how popular that museum has been for all walks of life, people from different backgrounds and colors. And so we want to make sure that hopefully the Women's Museum, and again, it's back to the vision, is really an all-encompassing museum that just highlights these amazing stories. So thank you.
Any other presenter comments before we get another?
Well, I guess I should say, sorry to come up again, but we do have a vision. And since we're just about to become virtual in a year, we are developing it, but we are very much interested in also the hidden stories, storytelling. The first big effort this year is going to be about the hidden waves of feminism. So we're looking at, because it's our 25th anniversary, the way that women's history is taught according to 4 waves, which has huge omissions and huge issues about inclusion and so forth. So our first effort is to look at the hidden waves of feminism, we're calling it, going back to the French Revolution, actually, and addressing the period from 1920 to 1960. And most of the scholars, if you do look at our list, will be involved in these symposia. And it's a very particular and inclusive and continually adding stories so that we get a better sense of women's history. Our opening exhibition will be about activism and specifically about African American women and tied to the District of Columbia, where we feel there's a very big story to start with. We are also going to be able to take on topics that are very controversial, that perhaps are difficult for bigger, certainly government organized institutions. And that is very much our perspective, to look at issues that are very important and very controversial and try to present them fairly, but not eschew projects that might be controversial. And when I started, the only exhibit that was up in Washington about women's history was the ball gowns of first ladies, which had been up forever. And, you know, for us, that is not the kind of exhibit that, nothing to say, but that really was the longtime exhibit about women. And so we're looking at a very different approach. So that just to say what we're doing right now.
I'd like to just ask sort of what is the 20-year vision of the 2 museums, the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum and the National Women's History Museum? Do you see yourselves merging in some way, or do you see 2 separate museums with slightly different foci? Julissa, maybe you could start on that.
I think Susan really should address that since she's in conversation with Lonnie Bunch. So maybe. Or
Okay.
Julissa, you're certainly welcome to try to address that. I think it's premature, frankly. We're all figuring out how we're going to work together, and we'd love to work together. But Susan, you might.
Well, what I will say is that it's hard, believe it or not, to look 20 years down the road. I think right now what we're excited about is the progress that's been made with the legislation and what's happening at the Smithsonian. We are continuing to do what we're doing because we think, you know, the topics that we talk about and the education we provide is critically important. And we don't have a formal relationship between the 2 institutions right now, but we do collaborate. And I think it would be wonderful to be able to do more of that. But in the meantime, we're going to keep doing the education we do. And I think there's room and need for many different points of view. I mean, I just have to say, coming from the, the corporate world, but also a lot of not-for-profit work, I find it somewhat amusing sometimes to think about the fact that we believe there can't be a lot of institutions involved studying different issues, because I get this question a lot. And I do think funding aside, it's wonderful to have complementary views and visions and work that people can do and different focus. There are thousands of cultural institutions that coexist. The idea that there could be a handful of institutions who focus on women's history seems quite fair. And so I think we have a great opportunity to collaborate, and I hope we can do that. There's nothing formal that's been done, but beyond that, we have, some clear plans for the next probably several years. And I think we'll just continue to be able to judge what the best opportunity is for our supporters and our mission.
Great. Sue?
Julissa?
I would echo Holly and Susan's comments. It is a bit premature for us to speak to that. And I would echo my earlier comments as well. It's just the deep appreciation we have for this organization and so many organizations that have gotten us this far.
Sue, I'd like to breach a couple of questions that we got in the mail from Sabrina.
We
Sabrina,
just have a couple of minutes left.
well, let's get through them.
Go.
How much exhibition space will be designated to documenting the history of gender discrimination in the U.S.? That's one. How much exhibition space will be designated to lesbian achievements? How much exhibition will be designated to transgender women achievements? And how much exhibition space will be designated to women's athletic achievements? Who wants to start?
Holly?
Well, I think, again, that's a very hard question to answer. I don't know if that's geared towards the Smithsonian, but without a director and a leader and all the planning, I think it's pretty hard to say. From our perspective, we've done virtual exhibitions on all of those topics, and we intend to do actual exhibits touching on many of those topics. So
I'm happy to comment just the same. Again, just where we are with the legislation passing in December and where we are in the site selection process. So many of these answers to these questions are dictated as we go along. It is a little bit premature. I think that overarching the sentiment for the Smithsonian across our 19 museums is to tell stories through different lenses and to bring to light stories that have not been told, or to amplify those stories through a different perspective, through a different light. And I think that will always continue to be the case, not just in this museum, but across the institution.
Any final comments from our presenters? Any final comments from any attendees? Hearing none,
I would just like to say thank you for putting this all together. It's been a great conversation. We have a lot of hard work ahead of us, but one of the biggest, hardest things we did is getting the legislation passed. So it's really positive news when we know that there will be a museum within the Smithsonian family, and we're excited to, about the future. So thanks for including me, at least. Thank you.
I would also add just the same as mentioned earlier, we shared my colleague's email. I encourage folks to most certainly reach out. We'd love to hear from folks across different organizations, and really thank you again for this kind invitation. It's been a great conversation.
and the whole video of this presentation will be available on our website. And also we're going to have some writers. Sheila Wachowski will be writing some articles for Ms. in our CWI newsletter. We'll have a summary. We want to thank you all for your fantastic information, and we're all excited about the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum and all the other Smithsonian and non-Smithsonian museum activities. And we want to encourage continued cooperation because we all have a lot to learn and contribute to each other. So I want to thank you all very, very much. Anybody else want to have a parting word? Okay, I want to thank you all for attending the meeting, and please keep in touch.
Thank you again.
Thank you.